During the Second World War, the world has been somewhat more united than it has been at any other time in history, because, and I don't care if I make enemies for saying this, the Nazis were bad. For a brief period of time, people set aside their differences to end the Nazis, including the Nazis' former allies, the USSR. Hitler and Stalin, they were besties, you see, until they weren't, and as the Russians invaded Germany in retaliation at the same time as the Americans came in from the Western Front, the war ended. Hooray! Surely these two countries will take their recent joint victories, shared accomplishments, and existing alliance to become the greatest of allies. That's a shame. In the years shortly following the end of World War II, America became best pals with its greatest enemies and nearly ended the world over a dispute with former allies, and that is the most American thing I can think of. Insert Metal Gear Solid 3 joke here. The world being split into two led to a series of more and more brazen displays of power and combative sentiment than had ever been seen in international politics outside of outright war. Point 1. The Korean War. After the end of World War II, Japan's empire lost the Korean Peninsula, making America and the Soviet Union decide what needed to be done. In the end, North Korea was occupied by the USSR troops and South Korea was occupied by Americans. Surely this would not cause any problems. Over the coming years, independent states had organized, with each having light backing and oversight by their respective superpower. North Korea's government was led by a power-hungry authoritarian communist dictator with support from the Soviet Union, and South Korea had a power-hungry anti-communist dictator, and these two were constantly getting into fights. It only escalated, however, when North Korea launched a full invasion. While superpower involvement in the region was dwindling, and this would more accurately be framed as a simple dispute between random countries with no relation to the American or Soviet projects, America felt that they needed to immediately intervene. After all, what if the dictator was secretly under orders from the communists to take this incredibly vaguely American land and turn it communist and then turn everything communist by proxy? The following was actually a direct response to the appeasement policy that was practiced in Europe, which horribly failed to prevent World War II, so this might not have been as ridiculous as it seemed on the surface. Still, pretty ridiculous though. More than 1 million American soldiers died. This was still somewhat a success, however, as it managed to contain communism for a little longer. Immediately after the Korean War is our case study, however, the era of McCarthyism. Remember during World War II when the US and Soviet Union were begrudging allies? Well, that came at a cost. There were often Soviet spies in American government, despite the two teams supposedly being on the same side. In the 1950s and 60s, these spies became the subject of national attention. Despite there not being any more spies, people were terrified that spies were everywhere. In some sense, they were an enemy that was simultaneously too weak and too overpowering, who were such a big threat they would justify incredibly vague, broad powers exclusively to the ruler. In 1940, the Smith Act was passed, which criminalized people speaking out to advocate for overthrowing the US government. In 1948, 11 people were arrested under this bill and disputed the law as a violation of the First Amendment, beginning with the landmark case of Desc v. United States. This case was a total shambles in so many ways, but it did indirectly lead to a legal precedent which would dominate the entire American perception of the 1950s. In short, if you weren't an ultra-nationalist conservative, you were a terrorist who was secretly plotting to overthrow the American government. The argument goes, communism is a stateless society, so if you advocate for communism, aka anything that isn't capitalism, even if it isn't necessarily communism, you advocate for the American government being dissolved. If you advocate for the American government not existing, you have a plan to do that in a violent way. This line of reasoning was applied to anyone in any situation of protest, and is looked at today as a gross violation of the First Amendment. During this, U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy became the most popular person to use this line of reasoning against anyone and anything, to become so fervently anti-communist, even the U.S. Army accused him of being a bit overbearing, which is where the term McCarthyism comes from. The Second Red Scare was a significant transformative event in U.S. history because of the way it reshaped American society as permanently fearful and conspiratorial. You can't trust anyone, even your neighbors, because they could be a communist. To be communist is to hate America, and to hate America is to hate what makes one supreme. This is inseparable from the currently booming economy. For the first time in human history, capitalism was working, and you want to take away the iconic nuclear family? This refusal of community permanently damaged the American psyche. A constant conspiratorial distrust of anyone and anything that doesn't strictly adhere to the cult of tradition, which is now the absolute norm. And then a few things happened which are outside of the purview of this video. But needless to say, this was the beginning of America's exaggerated persecution complex being misdirected towards the working class.